Just a reminder, if you weren't here last time, the syllabus has changed slightly because as I noted last time, I will not be here on Wednesday, November the 11th. Therefore, I'm going to send out to you something that you should watch and that you will be responsible for, for the exam to cover November 11th. But also, that means we're going to read the death of Ivan Ilyich on the 16th. Or that is, we're going to discuss the death of Ivan Ilyich. Sorry, not Ivan Ilyich, it's a different book by a different Russian. The death of Ivan Denisovich. We'll read that on the 16th. And any papers that you choose to write on a day in the life of Ivan Denisovich, those will also be due on the 16th. Does everyone remember that from last time? Okay, I did announce that last time. Good. Okay. Any questions about that before we go on? Okay. It's not changing at all. There we go. All right. Okay, we're at another one of those points in the semester where I want to identify a transition. That is, we talked about the fact that in the middle of the 1700s, you can definitely witness a transition, a movement of economic and military power, ultimately a movement of diplomatic and imperial and colonial power to a different part of the world, away from Asia towards northwestern Europe. By the end of the 19th century, as we've already seen, there are some indications that power is moving away from Western Europe. That is, that places like the United States and Japan are themselves becoming much more significant players on the world stage. Despite the rise of these two powers, however, Europe is still this predominant actor in the world. European states still have large empires. They have significant armies and navies. They wield disproportionate economic influence all around the world. The First World War is going to change that. In fact, the First World War is going to dramatically change what the 20th century will look like, or is going to dramatically alter what we might think of as the course of the 20th century. If you looked at the world in 1914, and then you looked at it again, say, in 1924, you would find a place so significantly different, you'd wonder if it was the same, even sort of geographic location. So we're going to be talking about this week and next is some of the legacies of what they called at the time the Great War. They didn't call it the First World War because, of course, they hadn't had the Second yet. But you have not just a remaking of the way in which European states will interact with each other, how they will treat questions about war and the use of military force, but you also have a dramatic remaking of the political map. You have the end of some empires, the rise of other significant powers, the expansion of, in particular, European influence into parts of the world where previously there had not been such significant inroads by European powers, specifically by the British and the French. That is, if you look at the world 1914 to 1924, you witness a decade or so of really dramatic change. Change that ultimately will help push that center of power globally further away from Europe and much more towards North America, and ultimately towards the Pacific and Asian region as well. So that's why we're talking about the First World War. So extensively in this course because it has a huge impact. In some historians, when they look at the 20th century, they say basically everything we think about as a hallmark of the 20th century is a product of the First World War. They say if you want to start the history of the 20th century, really start in 1914. The first 13 and a half years, or so of the 20th century look a lot like the 19th century. European imperialism, colonialism. Everything after 1914 looks dramatically different. You have an imperial world, a colonial world that goes to war in 1914 and comes out the other side dramatically changed. So that's the overarching thing, or the overarching theme I want to present today. We're not going to talk too much about the origins of the First World War. I used to try to talk more about the origins of the First World War, but you wind up with this huge sort of diagram with arrows connecting this and assassination and Russians mobilizing and the French saying something and that. So I've decided to simplify very much. Why does the First World War start? No, why? Germany. There we go. There's the answer. Germany. That is, the Germans. As is now almost universally recognized, it was the Germans' fault. A sentence that you can apply to much 20th century history. But in this case, we're talking simply about the First World War. The Germans, who believed that in order to maintain their power in Europe, they were ultimately going to have to fight a war, used the events of the summer of 1914 to basically drive Europe into war. A war the Germans think they're going to win, but which in fact they are not going to win. A war which is going to develop into a rather dramatic stalemate in Europe and is going to spread rather quickly to the rest of the Mediterranean, at least. I want to talk a few minutes about how and why this is a world war, first of all. This is the first time since the 7 Years' War that you have all the European powers involved in a conflict. And it's not simply European powers involved, but it's European colonial powers. That is, a lot of the European states that go to war have themselves their own colonies outside of Europe. But when these states go to war, their colonies go to war as well. That is, in August 1914, when the world, quote unquote, goes to war, it's not just European states, but it's places like Australia and Canada, places like French colonies in Senegal, German colonies in Southwest Africa, Italian colonies in Libya, Italian colonial state in Libya. A place like India, directly ruled by Britain, is going to send at least 1 million men to serve in the British Army in various theaters of this war. So it's a global war, first of all, because it's a colonial war. By 1917, of course, with the arrival of the United States into the war, it's an even more extensive conflict. Again, if we're looking why the United States comes in, we've got to look at once again. Germany. Germany is a short answer response to just about any question about 20th century history that deals with why things went wrong with the Germans. Once you've eliminated the Germans, then you can look for other possibilities. But first, look at the Germans. The expansion of this war is not only due to the fact that these are largely colonial powers, but also the fact that in the fall of 1914, a power that's sort of on the fringes of Europe jumps into the war. That's the Ottoman Empire, what we now know as modern-day Turkey. The Ottoman Empire is, in many ways, a dying empire in the fall of 1914. They have already lost control of a lot of their possessions in North Africa. They're desperate to hold on to what they have in places like Syria and Lebanon. And in order to do that, in order to protect what they still have, and to try to fight off or to stave off any further European incursions into their territory, they jump into the war on the side of the Germans and the Austrians. That is, in the fall of 1914, the Ottoman Empire joins the war. It is, as we will see in the next couple of weeks, a disastrous move by the Ottomans. One which will cause, ultimately, the empire to collapse entirely. It's one of several empires that's going to collapse at the end of the First World War. But if you want to look at sort of a coming together, a moment where the entire sort of global scale and significance of this conflict comes together, you need to look in May 1915. In May 1915, with the Ottoman Empire now fully engaged in the war, you have a significant military encounter at a place called Gallipoli. Gallipoli is in the eastern Mediterranean. It's near the Straits, near now what was then Constantinople, now modern Istanbul. And in the spring of 1915, the British and Australian, basically British and Australian troops attempt to take this area here called Gallipoli to try to knock Turkey out of the war. It's a spectacular failure on the part of the British and the Australians. They are not well prepared. They don't have naval support. They're landed on these beaches where the Turkish army, which is now being advised by German officers, are able to sort of rain fire and artillery down upon them. The result is you get significant thousands of British and Australian and New Zealand troops all trapped on these beaches, where people die of wounds, people die ultimately of dysentery and other diseases that run rampant before they can be evacuated off the beach. This day, Gallipoli, or this event, Gallipoli, is remembered very to this day, it is remembered with a great deal of not simply you might say sort of resentment, but it's also enshrined in Australian history in particular. That is, in May of every year, you get Anzac Day. Anzac meant the Australian New Zealand Army Corps. The Anzacs was a nickname for Australian soldiers in the First World War. This is basically the equivalent of, you might say, Australian Memorial Day. And it's treated in Australia as a reminder not only of the sheer cost of this war, that is remembering the 20,000 or so Australians who died at Gallipoli, but also it is indicative of Australia declaring some separation from Britain. After Gallipoli, the Australians are never quite as, shall we say, loyal colonists or loyal members of the British Empire as they were before. They stay in it, but they're much more critical. They resent the fact that they think that they were used basically as cannon fodder for the British Empire in 1915. What I want to show in a larger sense here is that Gallipoli demonstrates the global scale of this conflict. You have Australians, New Zealanders, and British forces fighting Turks and Germans in the Eastern Mediterranean. So you see here the range of the war. People from all the way across the world, from more than halfway around the world, places like Australia and New Zealand, fighting in Turkey for Britain against Turks who have been armed and advised by the Germans. So this is a global conflict. Not as global or as encompassing as the Second World War will be, but this is one of the reasons why at the end of the First World War people say, not only will they call this the Great War, they'll say this is the war to end all wars, because it was so big. 20 years later they'll have to revise that judgment. But at the time, it's the biggest conflict the world has ever seen. Yeah?
Is Gallipoli the one that Winston Churchill totally messed up?
Yes, Winston Churchill totally messed it up. Churchill returns again. Yeah, he's the one who planned the whole thing and had to resign because of it. There's also a movie made of it featuring a very young Mel Gibson. It was made about 35 years ago. It's the one Mel Gibson movie you're allowed to go watch. Or the one historical Mel Gibson movie you're allowed to go watch. Whatever you guys want to do with Lethal Weapon is fine. But it's actually a good sort of demonstration of how the Australians were in many ways sort of left deserted on these beaches by the British Navy in particular. Okay. I need to skip ahead a little bit now. So this is the global impact of the war, the scope and scale of the war. What I want to turn to now a little bit is the way in which this war affects the nations who fight, in particular the European nations. Not in the sense of their geopolitical or economic position, because we're going to come to that, but what this means for how people will think about war. You can't understand the 1920s and 30s, and you can't understand how people in Europe in particular react to the rise of leaders like Mussolini and Hitler. You cannot understand how they treat them unless you first appreciate the significant impact that the First World War has on those who lived through it and those who survived. That is, the First World War brings about a fundamental transformation in how people think about war and the necessity of war and really sort of the morality or ethics of war. When these states go to war, when European states go to war in 1914, they have not, for the most part, fought any protracted conflicts for close to 100 years. There has been no European war we're speaking of since the Napoleonic Wars. Yes, the French were handily defeated by the Germans in 1870, but that only took about 6 weeks, and the Germans barely broke a sweat. So you have a lot of states that go off to war without a realization of what full-blown Europe-wide war is going to mean. These are states that are used to fighting little colonial wars. As we saw at the Battle of Omdurman, taking on thousands of outgunned Sudanese troops, taking or putting down insurrections and rebellions against colonial authority in West Africa and South Africa. These are not European states that have experienced large-scale war for a long time. And one of the things that that has to be added to that is not only have they not experienced large-scale war for a long time, they also have not experienced long war or a prolonged war featuring the kind of weaponry that is now around by 1914. Automatic weapons like machine guns, long-range and more precise artillery, chemical weapons. The First World War is going to see the introduction of the tank. It's going to see the introduction of the airplane into warfare. You have significant technological advances, but you haven't had a corresponding shift in, you might say, sort of strategic or tactical thinking by the military leadership or leaders who are charged with fighting this war. This is a war that is going to continue to be, for at least most of it, fought on, you might say, sort of 19th or even 18th century, well, not even formalities, but ideas about how war is fought. The greater number of troops you have, the greater the chances of success. That is, that no matter how many troops, that the number of troops is indicative of victory, rather than the sort of equipment that is indicative, that will be sort of much more predictive for who's going to win. If it was simply the sheer number of troops, the Russians would have won every war in the previous 300 years, because all they have then, what they have over everyone else is just lots of Russians. But they're not well equipped, they're not well supplied, and they're not well trained. The result being, lots of Russians get killed in the First World War, without Russia being able to make any sort of significant military advances. So this is the thing. People go off to this war without much of an idea of what war is going to be like, and they don't have really much idea of the impact that all of these new technologies are going to have on war. The result is this. This is a recruiting poster from 1915. When Europe went to war in the summer of 1914, people flocked to join up. They flooded recruiting offices. Whole groups of people left school, left colleges, left their offices and joined up en masse in Germany, in France, in Britain in particular. People believed this would be a fairly short war, that war offered opportunities for glory and for valor, that war was in some senses a romantic adventure. Yes, you might get your hair messed a little bit, but otherwise, what had the previous 50 years been? It had been a series of sort of one-sided wars. The only exception to that had been the Russians being humiliated by the Japanese we've talked about. But that was largely discounted because the Russians were seen already as fairly inept. So you have this sense that going to war is like going off on a big adventure. And even in 1915, this idea is still around, as you can see in this recruiting poster, where it says here, the army isn't all work. Yes, you'll have to do a little fighting and shooting and things like that, but there'll be plenty of time for soccer and cricket and other sorts of sports. The assumption or the message being presented here is one that equates service in the military with service in or with participation in a sport or a game. People told stories of a young captain in the British Army who led a charge across no man's land, holding what they would call a football, what we would call a soccer ball, and in essence sort of kicked it off and said, "Let's go, boys." And everyone said, "How dashing." He was cut to bits by a machine gun approximately 6 seconds after this happened. War, as it turned out, was not glorious. War was long, tedious, dirty, violent, and destructive, not only of people's bodies, but of people's minds. And to give you an idea of just sort of how much destruction, these are some numbers here, roughly, of casualties. And there are there's sort of 4 different groups here that I want to point out, of 4 different numbers. The first is just how large this war was. The green bars here represent the number of troops mobilized for war. As you can see, the Russians could put 12 million men into the field, the Germans about 11, the British about 9. Right there, you're getting close to 25 million troops, and that's only 3 countries participating. If you yourself weren't fighting in the war, you knew someone who was fighting in the war, or at least you knew someone who was working in the war effort at home. With this many people at war, states switched to what might be called a total war footing. Economies were regulated. Production was regulated. People were drafted into work in munitions factories and places like that. Consumer spending was greatly restricted. There were there was rationing placed on items like coal, as well as food items and cloth, clothing, etc. So that's the first number. That is, you have millions mobilized. Second, you have the number who died. That's the number in red up there. Close to 2 million in the Russian case, close to 2 million in the British case, about 900,000 in the 2 million in the Russian, 2 million in the German, 900,000 for the Brits, about 1 million for the French, 1 million for the Austrians. To give you an idea of the scale of the slaughter that went on in places, though, the Russian deaths here are basically equal to the Germans, close to 2 million. And that's with the fact that the Russians basically stopped fighting in the middle of 1917. As the Russian Revolution gained steam, and the Russian army, in many cases, refused to fight any longer. That is, the Germans fought on for another year, longer than the Russians. And they still wound up basically tied in number of deaths. Had the Russians fought another year, there's no question but their death toll would have been over 2 million. For the Russians, 2 million, or just about 2 million dead out of 12 million mobilized. Roughly 15% of all Russian soldiers who went to war died. That's a staggeringly high mortality rate, even for this brutal warfare. You have a third group. This is the gray group here. These people are the wounded. You have, as I said, sort of massive increases in technology. You also do have significant increases in medical treatment, in frontline care, in surgical treatment of injuries suffered on the battlefield. Something that has continued even as war has become technologically much more advanced. I guess if you could say that, advanced. That people become much more efficient at ways of trying to destroy each other. So too has combat medicine. People now survive injuries that would have killed them even in the first war in the Gulf, for example, back in 1991. That is, in 30 years, you've had 20, 25 years, you've had a significant jump in particularly trauma medicine, emergency medicine, combat medicine. A similar thing goes on in the First World War. Lots of people survive what had previously been fatal injuries. But they survive, oftentimes, with significant disabilities. Not only are people in Europe seeing mass deaths, seeing huge mobilization people, but during and after the war, and for several decades after the war, wounded veterans are going to be everywhere. People who've been blinded by gas, people who've been burned, people who've lost limbs, people who are not perhaps injured in a way that you can see visibly, but people who suffer enormous psychological trauma from what they've been through. The First World War leads people in psychiatry and psychology to begin addressing what they will first call shell shock. A progress that ultimately will lead to today's treatment of things like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Between the First and Second World War, there's a huge jump forward in how soldiers who suffer psychologically during a war are treated. During the First World War, the British actually execute about 400 men for quote-unquote cowardice. They have now, doesn't really do them much good, but they have now officially pardoned all of those people in the last 10 years, because reviewing the files, reviewing the histories, show that these were not people who were quote-unquote cowards, but oftentimes people who had been fighting for 3 years and had simply had enough and could not go on. That is, the people who were executed oftentimes were not people who sort of threw down their arms and ran away at the first sight or the first instance of combat, but people who oftentimes persevered for 2 to 3 years on the front lines before ultimately saying they had had enough. That is, in the First World War, you have, when you add up all the forces together, several thousand people executed for cowardice. In the British Army in the Second World War, no one's going to be executed for that. That's how significant a jump there is. That's how significant the recognition is that the war creates profound psychological trauma and dislocation. Okay. One more category here I just have to mention. It's this sort of different green right here. As you can see here, it says missing and POW. The category of prisoner of war was not a new one. What is new in the First World War is the category of missing. Missing, presumed dead. in particular? Well, people had always gone missing during war. There had never been anywhere in recorded history the number of people who quite simply disappeared as there was in the First World War. Now again, in this day and age, it's much harder for people to disappear during war because scientific advantages, DNA identification, things like that, have allowed remains, body parts, etc., to be identified. But in the First World War, you have thousands of men, almost entirely men, who just simply disappear. They're blown to bits. They drown. Sometimes on the high seas, sometimes they drown in the mud and the muck of the trenches of Western Europe. They are so disfigured when they are killed that it is not possible to identify them. One thing about the First World War, let me skip ahead for a second if I have it. Where'd it go? Shoot, I don't have it. All right. One thing about the First World War is that it creates so many in this category of missing that at the end of the war, just about every state who fought in the war, every nation that fought in the war, has to create a new category of war memorial. That is, the tomb of the unknown soldier, in which can be placed the remains which cannot be identified and which serve as sort of the reminder. It serves sort of metaphorically, if not actually, as a tomb for all those who have simply disappeared. That is, there is such an outcry in places like Britain and France, even in this country, about the numbers of people gone missing, that the governments respond by creating this tomb of the unknown soldier. Yes?
I know there was a lot of trench warfare.
Yeah.
Is that part of the reason there were so many missing, like, because of the whole concept of...
Oh yeah, people were buried in trenches that sort of, collapsed under artillery. People fought in the mud. I mean, bodies were simply left out in no man's land to rot away, and because it was too dangerous to retrieve them. That's part of it. It's also simply the sheer destructiveness. That is, people literally being blown apart by artillery shells. People being cut literally to pieces by automatic weapons fire. You have, and again, because there's not the technology available to identify people at this point, you have a lot of remains simply buried in mass graves. People don't have identification. People didn't oftentimes wear identifying tags. So it was very hard to return remains for burial. And that's one of the reasons why many of these states after the war create these tombs of the unknown soldier. It's an indication of just how deeply people feel this loss and how much they understand that this is something entirely new. In fact, if you study the First World War, and you read studies of the First World War, one of the themes that recurs is this idea of irony. Irony not meaning something humorous or something like that, but irony meaning the failure of reality to live up to your expectations. The failure of reality to live up to your expectations. That is the classical definition of irony. And that, for many people, represents, or that encapsulates, their experience in the First World War. People go off thinking war is glorious, war is great, war is something that will be over quickly. Instead, you get a war that is in some ways surreal. A war that is fought, as I've mentioned here before, a war that is fought on an industrial scale. This is a munitions plant in Britain. A war that presents you with images like this, where there are such things as gas attacks. There's the things such as gas attacks that no one had ever contemplated before. That you have situations like this, where not only is the man wearing a gas mask, the horse is wearing a gas mask too. By the end of the war, you had gas masks for horses, donkeys, mules, even dogs. And gas is another thing that contributes to this sort of surreal atmosphere. These people look like they're on some sort of H.G. Wells novel at the time, some sort of random science fiction novel. You have people who have to fight in conditions where gas is being used. By the end of 1914, all the sides involved in this are using poison gas. Not just mustard gas that burns your lungs, but ultimately chlorine gas, which basically destroys your nervous system and is far even deadlier than mustard gas. Chlorine gas also basically produces this greenish fog. So you're out there fighting, you're wearing a gas mask, and you're out there in this green fog. No one imagined war would be like this. I'll give you one other example of the, shall we say, surreality, of this. Oh, shoot, okay. Hang on, let's go. Let's go back to this. This is a recruiting poster. I realize it came out kind of blurry when I blew it up, but this is a recruiting poster in 1917 in Britain depicting German air raids which had taken place over the previous year in London. The Germans used Zeppelins, giant blimps, and they quite literally dropped bombs, artillery shells, out of the cabins where you steered these blimps. And this is also perhaps the most British poster ever, because it says, enlist, by staying at home you are giving your approval to this kind of thing. That is, this is not just simply surreal, it's also quite kind of unsporting and uncivilized to kill people like this. The civilized way to kill you is like this, the uncivilized way is this. A lot of that sort of language. But this again, nothing that anyone had ever imagined possible. Zeppelins floating over cities like London. Zeppelins that could not be stopped. Zeppelins that were, that seemed almost sort of, to appear out of nowhere and then disappear back into the haze. The Germans managed to bomb several houses. They bombed a school. They bombed a couple of local government buildings. It wasn't sort of, a dramatically effective way for the Germans to fight the war, but it did cause significant consternation in Britain. One of the things that emerges from the First World War is this conviction that this is how the war is going to be fought in the future. Not necessarily Zeppelins, but airplanes, but that aerial bombardment and the targeting of cities is the way of the future, is the war of the future, I should say. That it's going to be the most efficient way to fight. People will say, oh no, we're not going to have massed armies, we're not going to have huge pitched battles. Instead, we're simply going to have selective bombing. It's one of the reasons why in the Second World War, just about every side who fights will turn at one point or another to the extensive bombing of large cities, ostensibly in the name of reducing economic capacity and industrial capacity, but in a larger sense trying to sow terror in a population. As it turns out, bombing doesn't actually make people more terrified. It does. It ticks them off, and bombing is not nearly, to this day, bombing is not nearly as accurate as people claim it is. That is that tales are replete from the Second World War through the present day of people saying we were able to drop a bomb. Basically, the invention of the Second World War was called the Norden bomb sight, and they said we could drop a bomb in a pickle barrel. If your pickle barrel was about 18 miles wide, then you had a shot. American flyers used to come back after bombing Germany, and they'd be asked this after-action report, and they'd say, well, sort of what economic damage have you done? They said, we've greatly reduced Germany's agricultural capacity. You think about that for a second. So you have this idea, though, that bombing is the future. Chemical weapons, not the future. Chemical weapons will be, in essence, banned from international warfare after the First World War. Yeah, exactly. The chemical weapons will be deemed sort of uncivilized. Bombing from the air, that's the way forward. That's what the civilized nations do. As long as we're doing it. If you're doing it, it's uncivilized. If we're doing it, it's because we're trying to minimize damage to civilians. So you have a war that's surreal, a war that ultimately brings people to appreciate or to realize that they had not appreciated what war could be like. Go to one other statistic here. I've talked about, sort of the people dying, the surreality of it. Just to give you an idea here, this is casualty numbers, dead plus wounded, in various sorts of engagements. I'll talk about one in particular here. In July 1916, the British launched a huge offensive at a place called the Somme River, the Battle of the Somme. As you can see here, 1,200,000, million. That's the number of casualties. That is killed, wounded, or missing. To break this down in a little bit more perspective, on the first day of this battle, July 1st, 1916, 20,000 British soldiers died in the first day. Ultimately, the Battle of the Somme does nothing to relieve the stalemate in Western Europe. And it comes to stand for, at times, the sort of absurdity of the sacrifice that's going on. One of the remarkable things people who chronicle the First World War say is that apart from the Russians, there are very few, if any, mutinies, uprisings, displays of discontent by soldiers during this war. Given the fact that they were oftentimes put in not just untenable or unwinnable positions, but they were basically led like lambs to the slaughter. One British writer said of the British Army during the First World War, he said they are lions led by donkeys. That is, the generals, whose ideas were always throw more people and more people and more people at the problem. So one of the things that comes out of this war is a sense that war is not a glorious thing, and also a sense that war has not actually settled anything. All you get at the end of the war, many who've lived through it believe, is a slight rearrangement of the distribution of power in Europe and some really significant problems that do not bode well for the future. So I want to talk a little bit about the impact here outside of this sort of psychological impact. That is, you first of all have people convinced that war is not the way forward because of the number of deaths, the number of casualties. That's one of the reasons why, in places like Britain and France in the 1930s, there's going to be a real reluctance to take on Napoleon and Hitler. You sometimes hear people talk about the word appeasement. Still used in political discourse or political rhetoric today. That is, if you're seen as not being as tough on someone or some dictator or something like that, to whom previously perhaps you had sold arms, but now had decided was enemy number one, you're an appeaser. Appeasement meaning you're the kind of person who wanted to placate Hitler. The first rule of political arguments is that the first person to mention Hitler has to leave the room. There's actually the law of political writing called Godwin's Law, of the guy who coined it. Basically saying, the first person who brings up Hitler has to leave. Because you cannot have political arguments. Somebody says, well, you're just like Hitler. No, that's it. You're not. So, please remember that. Appeasement is oftentimes said, well, it's sort of these weak-willed leaders in Britain and France who refuse to understand Hitler, refuse to understand the existential threat that he was. And he was. But a lot of their refusal or a lot of their reluctance to take on Hitler had its roots in the fact that people back home had no desire to take on Hitler. It would have been very hard, if not impossible, to convince the British and the French populations in the mid-1930s to go to war with Germany or to go to war with Italy because of what people had lived through. A war in which, as I said, everyone knew someone who had served or was involved in the war effort directly in one way or another. You also had so many people who knew someone or were connected to someone who hadn't come back. In fact, at times, someone who had actually gone missing completely. So you have a legacy of the war already. A real reluctance among many in Europe, unfortunately not the Germans, to see war as a problem, not a solution, even in the most extreme cases. But that's not the only thing. If you want to understand why there's a reluctance to go to war again in the 20s and 30s, people also are going to point to other elements of the war's impact. In the first place, this war is destructive politically. There are four empires, or four self-described empires, who go into the war and come out the other side no longer empires. The Ottoman Empire, as we'll talk about next week as well, is broken up. All that remains is Turkey. The German Empire, gone. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had included places like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, etc., or what became Yugoslavia, etc., gone. And the Russian Empire, the only member of the only one of the sort of allied forces, the so-called victorious forces, which also lost an empire because they had their own revolution. Russians didn't even finish the war. The Russian Revolution, as we'll be talking about very soon, is a shockwave, or causes shockwaves throughout Europe, because it's a socialist revolution. People say, what does war do? War reduces you politically. War provides enough chaos, enough dislocation that you can have revolution. You can even have a socialist and or communist revolution of the type they have in Russia. That's terrifying to people in Europe, in Western Europe in particular. The idea that war can ultimately dislocate a society so much that the Bolsheviks or Lenin or Stalin emerge on top. During the 20s and 30s, many people in Britain, in France, in Italy, even in Germany, elsewhere in Europe, in this country, they will look at the global political scene and they will say, communism is much more dangerous than anything else that's out there. And that includes Hitler and Mussolini. Hitler and Mussolini very publicly will state and will reiterate throughout the 1930s their vehement opposition to socialism of any kind, and in particular to Soviet-style socialism or communism. One of the key ingredients of what comes to be known as fascism, the sort of loose ideological designation under which we can put both Mussolini and Hitler. One of the key elements of fascism is its intense anti-socialism. Lots of words get thrown around these days in politics, like fascist, socialist, communist, mostly by people who have no idea that these words have been used previously in history or that these words have specific meanings. You cannot be a fascist socialist. I've heard people describe others, prominent people, as they are fascist socialists. You cannot be that. A fascist socialist is, the only way I can describe a fascist socialist, if you had a fascist socialist, is there's there's oftentimes sort of philosophical experiments that involve cats. You know, this is taking a little bit of a detour, but you may have heard of Schrodinger's cat. Has anyone ever heard of that? Philosophical paradox. We won't go into that, but it's whether or not basically a cat in a box exists. There's a different one, a little more fun, which is basically cats always land on their feet, right? Toast always lands butter side down. So if you strap toast butter side up to the back of a cat and throw it off a counter, it will never actually land. It will just keep spinning. Because the butter side has to land down, but the feet have to land down too. So in essence, it will just spin forever, suspended about 8 inches above the ground. This is not, as I said, more serious philosophical discussion. But calling someone a fascist socialist, you can't be a fascist socialist. That's the equivalent of the cat spinning 8 inches above the ground. A fascist socialist is someone who just feels how they cannot exist. Because fascists despise socialists. They hate socialists. The entire fascist ideology is built in many ways around being anti-socialist. It's what allows Hitler, Mussolini, other very authoritarian leaders in the 1930s to attract even some positive attention elsewhere in the world because they are seen as so staunchly anti-communist, staunchly anti-Bolshevik, anti-socialist. So there is this fear, not only is there sort of a general sense of like, look what war does to populations, it's the fact that what does war do? War destroys political institutions. War provides opportunities for revolutions, even socialist revolutions. One other thing that many after the war will note is that war not only destroys political institutions, but war, for the defeated and for the victors alike, is economically disastrous. That is, that going on a total war footing, fighting an extended conflict for 4 to 5 years, is absolutely ruinous, even for the most prosperous economies. The major example here is Britain, one of the so-called victors at the end of the First World War. Britain goes into the war as the world's largest creditor nation. That is, the rest of the world owes more money to British banks, the British government, British institutions, British lenders, than Britain owes the rest of the world. By 1918, Britain is the largest debtor nation in the world. That is, British institutions, the British state, now owe more money to other people than they owe to the Brits. In 4 years, the sort of global financial position of Britain has been completely reversed. The world's largest creditor nation to the world's largest debtor nation. A lot of those debts were incurred to American financial firms. The City of London, which had been a financial powerhouse in the 19th century, everyone wanted to borrow money there, raise money there, bank there, keep their funds in pounds. That changes. People start to say, well, Britain has all this debt. How strong is the pound? How strong is the British economy? We need something that's going to be much more stable. There is a huge flood of global capital away from London and to New York. New York financial institutions do really well out of the First World War. In the 1920s, people want to start putting their money into dollars. Ultimately, they want to start putting it into the American stock market with disastrous consequences by 1929. But the British are being replaced as sort of the center for center of global finance. Previously, if you wanted to raise money, if you're out there in the world, you wanted to build a railway in Brazil, you wanted to mine in South Africa, anything like that, you went and you raised money in London. Now, more and more, that attention is shifting to New York. The other thing is that industrial prosperity, manufacturing prosperity, never recovers in Europe from the position of global dominance it enjoyed before the First World War. Before the First World War, Britain was, quote unquote, the workshop of the world. Britain and Germany combined to export more manufactured goods than any other powers in the world. Britain and Germany were the two dominant manufacturing powers. After the war, neither one is able to recover or to regain that level of prosperity or success. The Germans, because among other things, they have to pay huge amounts of fines or reparations to the British and the French at the end of the war, don't have any money to invest in industry. People don't have any money to spend on everything from new technology to consumer goods. The British have had to convert their entire economy to a war footing during the 19-teens. They've stopped shipping goods abroad. Textile factories are making uniforms and blankets and bedding for hospitals. Factories are making tanks, artillery pieces, shells. Labor is being diverted. Natural resources like coal are being diverted simply to aid in the massive production needed to sustain the war effort. What it means is that during the war, places around the world that had traditionally purchased British goods stopped doing so because there's no goods to buy. What happens is a phenomenon that is known as import substitution, which is exactly what it sounds like. With imports gone, you can no longer import textiles, you can no longer import factory machinery from Britain into a place, for example, like Mexico. You have to find substitutes. In some cases, that means building your own domestic manufacturing capability. In other cases, it's finding other trading partners who will supply these goods. In the case of Central and South America, it's the United States, which at least for the first couple of years that the rest of the world is fighting, stays out of the war. American firms begin to do much more business in Central and South America, replacing British and German manufacturing. In Asia, it's Japan. Japan, as I mentioned before, declares that it is an ally of Britain and France and Russia and ultimately the United States during the war. But the Japanese don't actually have to do much fighting, if any at all. And in fact, Japan can focus on trying to replace or stand in for, take over for, British manufacturing in Asia. At the end of the war, British textiles are almost frozen out of parts of Asia because the Japanese have replaced them. They're making them more cheaply. They are flooding markets with them. They have even begun to undercut British manufacturing in colonies like India. Places that had previously been reserved simply for British goods. But because they weren't coming during the war, the Japanese were able to basically get into Indian markets. There was still a demand for things like cotton cloth and textiles, but British manufacturers couldn't meet it, so the Japanese did. Many Indians were quite happy with this. The Japanese sold good quality textiles at even lower prices than their British counterparts did. And after the war, British manufacturers find that they have lost enormous amounts of what you might call market share. So war is seen as ruinous, not only to people, to their physical and mental health, but war is ruinous to political institutions. It destroys empires. It creates conditions in which revolutions can flourish. It also destroys economies. whether it's the German economy, based where economic destruction follows the imposition of these fines and reparations on Germany, or to Britain and France, where they cannot regain markets for manufactured goods that they had previously depended upon. Nor can a place like London regain its its primacy, its position as the largest, most innovative, and most attractive financial capital in the world. There's a process ongoing. The Second World War is going to sort of complete the process, but there's a process already ongoing at the end of the First World War, where even the victor powers, the powers who think of themselves as the victors, are beginning to suffer long term through their loss of economic might, through their loss at times of colonial positions, or colonial possessions, I should say, or ultimately through their loss of through the loss of the idea of war as a useful tool of state. During the 1930s, there's going to be massive petitions and protests in Europe against war. Not really in Germany, not really in Italy, but in France and in Britain in particular, there's a huge political movement designed to prevent any further war from breaking out. As even Hitler acknowledged at the end of the 1930s, had Britain and France stood up to him in 1935 and 1936, when the German army was just beginning to rebuild, when the German army had not yet reached the capacity Hitler wished, when another of Hitler's adventures might have been stopped. And the result would have been, most likely, the removal of Hitler from power. Hitler, in the 1930s, was not yet trusted by the people who ran the German army. The people who believed that they were sort of the true servants of Germany, the true protectors of Germany. People who wanted very little to do with politicians. These were people who were not convinced of Hitler in the 1930s. They thought Hitler was reckless, that he was taking too many chances. But as it turned out, Hitler was successful. Every time he had sort of a face-off with the British and the French over the future of part of Czechoslovakia, Austria, other territories that Germany wanted to claim. Every time he faced off with them, they blinked. They retreated. They appeased, quote unquote. This not only had the impact of sort of strengthening Hitler's position, or Germany's position in Europe, it had the direct impact of strengthening Hitler in the eyes of the generals. The only people in Germany by the late 1930s who had any capacity to remove him from office. Would have been violent, would have been a coup, but it could have been accomplished. But they themselves, by 1938, 1939, are convinced that Hitler is some sort of diplomatic genius. Because every time he does something, which the French and the British are saying, don't you dare do that, and then he does it, then they say, okay, but don't you do another thing. And then they do it. It seems to be Hitler's, what perhaps the most notable biographer of Hitler called, he says this is the creation of the Hitler myth, that Hitler can do no wrong. Even among hardened soldiers who were very reluctant to get behind this guy, who, shall we say, obviously had some issues regarding stability, mental and otherwise, they were very reluctant to get behind him until they said, basically, he's some sort of genius. He's getting Germany whatever Germany wants. And he's not even having to fight for it. He just refuses long enough, and the British and the French cave in. Had the British and the French been able to stand up to him in 35 or 36, there is a significant chance, a very good chance, that Hitler would have been removed. Because the German army was not yet prepared. He would have been humiliated in any encounter with Britain or France. But in Britain and France, there is this real reluctance to see war as solving anything. And for that reluctance, for that hesitation, for that real sort of abhorrence of war that comes in the 1920s and 30s, You only have to look at what happened in the 19 teens. All right, I'm going to leave us there today. We will continue to talk about the larger geopolitical impact of the war over the next couple of sessions, but that is it for today. Thank you.